I hope you all are enjoying the sunshine, even if just from outside a window. Hopefully more sunshine outside is coming soon. But we're going to start with announcements and diversity share, as we always do. Couple announcements on my end. Folks should know that the Climate Hub is hosting a research forum on May 4th. If you haven't got that email, please let me know. If you're interested in joining a working group, they have working groups on environmental justice, flooding, agriculture, etc. So if that sounds like it's of interest to you and didn't get that email, please let me know. And I can send you that link that CIDR sent out, I think yesterday or the day before. So that's on the 4th of May, if you're interested in joining the Climate Hub Research Forum then. My other announcement is that we are going to head to after seminar gathering at Grain down Main Street, and they do have outside seating, so we can enjoy the outside together to connect with each other here and enjoy food or drink. Anyone else has any announcements, shout outs, events to know about?
I have a very exciting announcement, and it is that Dr. Nathan Thayer has just accepted a postdoctoral position with Virginia Tech as of this week. We are so proud of you, Nathan.
That's wonderful. Congrats, Nathan. And they are very lucky to have you there. Other announcements, shout outs, things we should know? Okay, anyone have a diversity share? This is our chance to share papers, reports, events that help us understand more about diversity, equity, inclusion, our role in it, whether it's in our field or our community here. Anyone have anything that we should know about for the diversity share?
As your diversity advocate, I just want to point out and draw your attention that everyone is invited this next Thursday, April 27th, to our college's Diversity Town Hall, where we will discuss the 2022 College Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Assessment. Everyone is invited to contribute, and everybody is invited to come and learn. It is on Zoom, and if for any reason you missed that announcement, please do drop me a note, and I will forward it to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Anyone else? Diversity shares, papers, reports that we should know about? Okay, on that note, thank you all again for being here. I'm going to pass it over to Emmanuel, who's been part of our seminar organizing committee, if I can get words correct in the correct order today. And Emmanuel is going to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. So our speaker for today, our guest for today is Dr. Talia. She had a bachelor's in mathematics and geophysics from Tel-Aviv University in Israel, and also a master's in physics. She got a PhD from Weizmann Institute in Israel, and she did a postdoc in the University of Reading, UK. And right now she's also still working. She's currently pursuing a second postdoctoral research at Tel-Aviv University in Israel. And she'll be resuming a new role as assistant professor in MIT by July 2023. And our research also includes like storm tracking, and I think she's more interested in atmospheric variables and storm tracking. So everybody, welcome, Dr.
Thank you very much. So should I share my screen now? Okay. Can you see my screen?
Looks great.
Oh, okay, good. So hi everyone, and thanks again for inviting me to give this seminar. And I'm really happy to present to you today this work that I've been doing recently in collaboration with Professor Nili Harnik from Tel-Aviv University. And here we try to examine the fundamental relation between low-level cyclones and anticyclones and upper-level Rossby wave-breaking events. So before I dive into the details, let me just start with some introduction to Rossby waves. So So Rossby waves, they are waves that occur naturally in rotating fluids. Now, whoops, sorry. Okay, now in Earth's atmosphere, so they are a result of the rotation of the planet and also the differential heating, so the temperature difference between the equator and the pole. So this gives rise to these large-scale Rossby waves. And now we actually find them both in the ocean and in the atmosphere, but they have very different spatial scales. So in the ocean, these waves are of the order of hundreds of kilometers. In the atmosphere, their length scale is thousands of kilometers, like 4,000, 5,000 kilometers. So these are really large scale waves. Now, what I'm showing you in this beautiful animation from NASA is the upper level wind speed in the atmosphere. So the upper level jet stream. And so here, colors show you the intensity of the wind speed. So red means very high wind speeds and blue is sort of weak winds. And the Rossby waves are basically the meandering of the jet stream. So you can really see these wavy perturbations in the jet stream, and you can see how they grow. So they usually start like as a small perturbation, but then they grow and they grow and they grow, and eventually they break and dissipate. And this is the Rossby wave breaking stage. And I forgot to mention that at every instant, we tend to find roughly 5 peaks in the wavy structure. So it means that we have a wave number of roughly 5 around the globe. But actually, the Rossby wave, you have a lot of wave numbers in the jet stream. So wave number 5 is the most prominent one, but you also have much smaller scale deviations. And these usually are associated with more rapidly varying development. So the large scale meandering are slower, but the smaller scale, they change more rapidly, and they are actually what gives rise to the day-to-day weather variability. Okay, the weather fluctuations that we feel. Sometimes it's today it's warmer, tomorrow might be colder, etc. Right. So and this is just another animation to show you again that atmospheric circulation and Rossby waves. So this is infraradiation from satellites, and it's for 1 month in July '94. And there's a lot of things going on here, but what I wanted to show you is that the Rossby waves, they tend to be found in the mid-latitudes. So this is the mid-latitudes of the southern hemisphere, and in the northern hemisphere, you can sort of see, again, these wavy perturbations. And you can also see that on average, they tend to propagate eastward in both hemispheres. In the tropics, you actually find much smaller scales. These are more convective systems, and you can see here these cute little tropical cyclones here. And these actually propagate on average westward. So there's a lot of things going on, but I just wanted to show you here that you can also see these sort of waves, and also how you can see here in this animation more clearly how they break. They start, for example, as a cyclonic circulation, but then they break and dissipate out, and another wave comes instead. So this is sort of an introductory visualization. Okay, now this is more the definition of Rossby wave breaking. So Rossby wave breaking is essentially a nonlinear phenomena. It means that this wave, when they grow, we say it's more linear. It's a linear growth stage, and when they break, it's because nonlinearity takes in. So we have in the equation nonlinear terms, and when the waves have very large amplitudes, these nonlinear terms become very important, and this is what basically makes the waves eventually break, and they break irreversibly because of dissipation. So once they break, that's it, and essentially they give their energy back to the mean flow. So yeah, actually I forgot to mention it here. Maybe I can come back to this animation. When the waves they grow, and then when they break, the jet becomes more zonal again. It becomes less wavy and more zonal, meaning more northeast oriented. When it's wavy, it's towards the north and the south. But when they break and dissipate, the jet becomes more zonal again. So it's always an interplay between the eddies, which are the waves, and the mean flow, the jet stream. Okay. Now the wave breaking results in a mixing of vorticity and temperature. Vorticity is just the rotation or the circulation of fluid parcel. So it results in a mixing of vorticity and temperature in the wave breaking region, which can either decelerate or accelerate the mean flow. So this is why these wave breaking events are important, because they influence the large scale flow, the jet stream. Now, a very famous paper by Thorncroft in '93 identified two different types of Rossby wave breaking events, appearing at the end of the life cycle of these Rossby waves. He coined them LC1 and LC2, and these are now very commonly used names. We say LC1 and LC2, and what we mean is this. So LC1 is the case when the waves end with anticyclonic wave breaking, meaning, so here what I'm showing you is what is called potential vorticity, but so it's related to vorticity and also to temperature, but the easiest way to think about it is just as if it's a tracer, or you can think about it as temperature. Let's say it's colder here because this is the pole, and it's cold air here and warm air here, and they're mixing. So one way this wave break is in an anticyclonic sense. You can see it from the contours of the PV. So in this case, it's from southwest to northeast. This is why it's anticyclonic. And another potential way for these waves to break is in a cyclonic sense. You can see it's like the flow is wrapping up cyclonically around itself. You can really see it from these animations that I showed you earlier, but it's kind of hard for me to tell you, to identify it from these very fast animations, but you can really see it in these animations. So there have been a lot of studies on these LC1 and LC2 life cycles of the Rossby waves, because they have very different impacts on the surface. For example, they can influence differently temperature anomalies on the surface, precipitation, they influence the large scale jet in a different way, and so on. So there's a lot of studies have looked at these things. And as I mentioned earlier, the wave breaking can also influence the jet stream. So they play a very important role in modifying the low frequency variability of the jet. And the way people usually think about it is through this equation that says that changes in the jet. So here the jet, you can think about it as the slowly varying part of the jet stream, okay? So time tendencies or changes in the jet would be proportional to the poleward or like meridional, so north-south flux of vorticity or potential vorticity in this case, but you can think about it as vorticity. And this means that when you have positive vorticity flux, you will tend to accelerate the jet, whereas if you have a negative vorticity flux, you will tend to decelerate the jet. Then Orlansky, in another very famous paper from 2002, suggested that during anticyclonic wave breaking events, so let me just return here. So during these sort of events, he suggested that what happens here is that you get anticyclonic vortices, which are really strong. And the cyclonic vortices are much weaker. So what these anticyclonic vortices do, they basically make the cyclonic vortex become thinner, and it starts wrapping around them anticyclonically. So this means that you have a positive V, a positive velocity here on a positive vorticity. So you have a positive vorticity flux here and a negative vorticity flux here. So he suggested that this would lead to a intensification of the jet forward of the braking and a weakening of the jet stream equatorward of the braking. So in other words, he suggested that during anticyclonic wave braking events, we should expect forward shift of the jet. And then opposite, when you have cyclonic wave braking, the sign of the vorticity changes, and this is why you actually get the opposite response. So you get an equatorward shift of the jet. So this wave braking also really influence the large scale jet. Okay. Now the relation to actual weather systems. So even though these Rossby waves, as I mentioned, are very much related to day-to-day weather variability, the relation to surface weather systems hasn't been examined so much, surprisingly. Most studies mainly focused on how the wave braking can influence the cyclone track and intensity. For example, this paper by Mezzari and Caballero from 2015, they suggested that, for example, if we have simultaneously a cyclonic wave braking occurring on a forward side and an anticyclonic wave braking occurring on the equatorward side, that would mean that there's a very strong jet stream in between them. So an intensified jet between them. And it also means that you have, and this is a result of the enhanced gradient of the PV. And PV is related to the strength of the jet stream. And then they were saying, because the jet is so strong, and they're saying it's also very zonal and it leads directly towards Europe. So they're saying the strong jet creates favorable conditions for cyclone growth, for storms to grow, and also leads them directly towards Europe. So there's an enhanced destructiveness of Western Europe. So this is just one example of a study that we're looking at how the wave braking influenced the cyclones later on. And there are a few others, but no previous study has really looked at the intrinsic relation between the weather systems and the wave braking events. And this is what really interested us, because we thought that it must be that these cyclonic and anticyclonic types of braking must be somehow related to the cyclones and the anticyclones, and we wanted to examine it. Okay, so the way we approach the problem is we combine both a storm tracking algorithm. So the one I use is called TRACK. It was developed by Kevin Hodges from University of Reading. So this algorithm identifies and tracks the low-level weather systems. In this case, I'm doing it using the low-level vorticity field, but you could also use it to track the sea level pressure anomalies, but gives very similar results. And we're also using a Rossby wave braking detection algorithm. And the wave braking detection algorithm is based on the overturning of the upper level PV field. Okay, as I mentioned, PV, you can think about it either as the vorticity or some sort of tracer. And the idea of braking is that, and the way the algorithm works, for example, here I'm showing you an example of a cyclonic wave braking. You see that the white is wrapping cyclonically around the gray shading. So the braking is identified once a certain contour, for example, the black contour that is highlighted here, crosses a certain longitude more than once. You can see if I would pass a line here in this longitude, you see that it crosses this contour 1, 2, 3. Whereas if it's just a wave and it's not breaking, at every longitude it would cross it only once. Okay, so the wave breaking happens once the wave starts to wrap around each other. And here's an example of an anticyclonic wave breaking. So you can see here the white air is now in the opposite. It's wrapping around the gray shading, but in the opposite sense, in an anticyclonic sense. I'm also showing you here the upper level jet in green, and you can see how different it looks in these two types of wave breaking events. Here, the jet, this is in the North Atlantic. So during anticyclonic wave breaking events, the jet is very narrow. It's only in the upstream region of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's much more southward and zonal, but very only in the upstream region. Whereas during anticyclonic wave breaking, the jet is very tilted. It's very deflected forward, and it extends all over the Atlantic Ocean. So you can see that the jet really behaves differently in these two types of wave breaking events. Here, this diamond means that this is the center of the cyclonic wave breaking as identified by the Rossby wave breaking detection algorithm. And the star is the anticyclonic wave breaking. And the blue lines are the blue lines are the cyclones, and the red lines are the anticyclones. So this looks kind of messy. You can't really tell a lot from these figures. But what I will show you now is the results we found by aggregating all the tracks of cyclones and anticyclones during these cyclonic and anticyclonic wave breaking events. Before I do that, I just want to show you where spatially these wave breaking events occur. So this study was focused on the North Atlantic, but roughly similar things are found over the Pacific Ocean. So frequency of cyclonic wave breaking events and anticyclonic wave breaking events. So you also see that they happen in very different spatial locations. So the color shading here show you the upper level jet stream. Okay, so this is the Atlantic jet, the time mean during winter. And so what you can see is that cyclonic wave breaking events, they occur more frequently in the upstream region of the Atlantic storm track, and also to the north of the time mean jet, whereas anticyclonic wave breaking events tend to occur more in the downstream region of the North Atlantic storm track, and also to the south of the time mean jet. And it's not by coincidence. It's because the northward of the time mean jet means that you are in the cyclonic shear of the jet. So if you have a jet stream, it means that the velocity is maximum in the middle, and it becomes weaker to the north, and then again weaker to the south. So to the north, the shear is cyclonic in the sense that if you just put a stick in the north side of the jet, it will start rotating cyclonically, just because the velocities are stronger in the middle and weaker in the north. And then the opposite would happen to the south. It would start rotating anticyclonically. So this is very much related to the fact that we find cyclonic wave breaking to the north of the jet and anticyclonic wave breaking to the south. Okay, and now this is what we found when we looked at composites of all the Rossby wave breaking events that we found in our data set. And these results were actually already done before us. This is just a check to see that we recover previous results. So what we find is the following. So the first row is the anticyclonic wave breaking events, and the second row is the cyclonic wave breaking events. The shading here in the left column is again the upper level PV. And in the right column, it's the upper level jet. And you can see, for example, that the jet looks really different in these two types of wave breaking events. During anticyclonic wave breaking events, the jet is sort of split into an upstream tilted jet and a downstream more zonal jet, whereas in cyclonic wave breaking events, it's more southward and zonal. And what I'm also showing you here in contours, in the left column, I'm showing you the low level vorticity. And in the right column, I'm showing you the sea level pressure anomalies. So what we find from these composites is that anticyclonic wave breaking events tend to have a low level anticyclone right below the center of the breaking. Okay, it's anticyclonic wave breaking, and we find an anticyclonic sea level pressure anomaly as well as an anticyclonic vorticity anomaly. So it's consistent with each other. And consistent with previous studies, we also find a negative sea level pressure anomaly to the north. So it's basically a cyclone-anticyclone dipole during anticyclonic wave breaking events, and the opposite dipole for cyclonic wave breaking events. So we find a cyclone and an additional anticyclones to its northeast. And this is similar to the results obtained in a previous study. However, we weren't sure if these are just signatures of the large-scale jet or are these actual cyclones and anticyclones, these sea level pressure anomalies that we see in the composite. So what we did next is we just aggregated all the positions of cyclones and anticyclones relative to the center of the breaking for all our wave breaking events. So for example, this is the center of the anticyclonic wave breaking. And here I'm showing you all the cyclones that we found. And these are all the anticyclones that we found relative to the center of anticyclonic wave breaking. So you get these beautiful figures that show you preferred locations of cyclones and anticyclones relative to the wave breaking. So for example, during anticyclonic wave breaking events, you tend to find two cyclones usually, one to the northeast and one to the southeast, and one anticyclone between them, which is closer to the center of the wave breaking. And generally, the cyclones to the northwest of the anticyclones are stronger than the cyclones to the southeast. And then during cyclonic, these are the sort of the different groups that we found. And then during cyclonic wave breaking events, we tend to find one cyclone close to the breaking center and then another anticyclone to its northeast. And this is similar to what we found from the vorticity composites. So you basically, during anticyclonic wave breaking, you find a cyclone, anticyclone, cyclone tripole. And during cyclonic wave breaking events, you find a cyclone, anticyclone tripole with a different orientation. Now, we also looked at where these cyclones and anticyclones reside in actual space. So before I showed you the relative to the breaking, but we also wanted to see where they are situated in real position. So during anticyclonic, so these are all the cyclones that we found during anticyclonic wave breaking events, and these are the anticyclones. And the contours here are just PDFs of like the cyclone counts, where we found the most cyclones and anticyclones. So you find again these two peaks of where you tend to find cyclones during anticyclonic wave breaking. And so the ones to the northwest, these are exactly these ones. to the northwest, they reside all over the Atlantic Ocean. But the ones to the southeast, interestingly, are over the Mediterranean region. And then the anticyclones are sort of between them. The star here is just the location where you most frequently get anticyclonic wave breaking. And the light contour are the PDF of the anticyclonic wave breaking frequencies. Now, during cyclonic wave breaking events, the cyclone are found more upstream in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're generally stronger. You can see that. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the color here shows you the intensity of the storms. So they're much stronger, and they're also located more in the upstream of the storm track. And the anticyclones are generally to their northeast, just as we expected from their relative positions. So there are really different cyclone and anticyclone, characteristics during the two different types of wave breaking events. Another kind of interesting thing that we found is also the longitudinal and latitudinal displacements of the storms are really different between the two types of breaking events, and also between those cyclones that reside to the northwest and to the southeast of the anticyclonic wave breakings. So, for example, here I'm showing you the longitudinal displacement of the storms from the moment of the breaking until their last time step. Okay, the dashed line is for the cyclones to the northwest, and the solid line for cyclones to the southeast. So what you can see is that while cyclones in the North Atlantic tend to propagate on average eastward, so these are longitudes, right? So they can propagate even 100 longitudes eastward. Those cyclones to the southeast, which are over the Mediterranean mainly, they propagate much less zonally. Okay, they're much more stationary. And also the same thing with the latitudinal displacement. So while cyclones to the northeast tend to propagate poleward, the cyclones to the southeast are again much more stationary and even propagate slightly equatorward on average. And this is something we even see from the simulations. And it's interesting because it's very much related to the anticyclonic wave breaking. Because, let me go back to these composites. I will go back to that later, but the idea is that you have a very strong anticyclonic circulation here. So it's basically pushing those cyclones southward and equatorward, whereas it's pushing these cyclones northward and eastward. And you know, of course, the tracks of cyclones are very important for weather and climate. So it's really interesting to see these different regimes and how it influences their tracks. And actually, part of my PhD work was to try to explain the poleward motion of cyclones in general. So it was interesting for me to see that actually there are some cases where cyclones propagate equatorward and not poleward. But it's because they're really influenced by these anticyclonic circulation during anticyclonic wave breaking events. Okay, and then to try to understand it better, what we did is we looked at the time evolution of the flow leading to the wave breaking. Okay, in this case, I'm showing you the time evolution of anticyclonic wave breaking events. But what we did here, instead of compositing, so before I showed you composites, which were centered around the wave breaking. But now what we did is instead, we were doing the composites around the anticyclones, okay? Because they're very close to the center of the anticyclonic wave breaking events. And the reason we now move to do it around the anticyclones and not around the wave breaking is because we want to look at the time evolution of the flow leading to the breaking, even before there was a signature of a wave breaking. So what we found is the following. First of all, here I'm showing you the upper level PV anomaly, and this quantity that is where we look for the breaking, as well as the sea level pressure anomaly. So again, the PV, you can think about it as vorticity. So blue here means anticyclonic. It's a ridge, it's an upper level ridge. Like we have a trough and a ridge at upper levels. So you get a very strong ridge at upper levels, and at low levels, you get a very strong anticyclone, just as we expected. But we can also go back to 2 days before, and what we see is that we actually also have a cyclone, which initially resides to its west, and then during the wave breaking, the anticyclone cyclone dipole starts rotating anticyclonically. So it's originally to the west, and by the end of the cycle, it's to its north. And at the same time, at the upper levels, this wrapping starts happening until you get the wave breaking. So in both at upper levels and at low levels, the flow starts rotating in an anticyclonic manner. And if you look at the jet stream, this is the upper level jet stream. So what you find is that the initially more wavy like flow becomes more and more splitted into an upstream strong and tilted jet, and a downstream more southward and weaker jet. And that makes sense if you think about the anomalous circulation associated with the anticyclone or the upper level ridge, because it's intensifying the jet here and weakening it here. So during the evolution, also what happens is that you start generating a very strong negative velocity between the ridge and the trough to its downstream, which also helps the breaking. This is why it's a nonlinear process, because this V prime is also advecting the anomalous velocity is also sort of pushing the anomalous vorticity. So it's a V prime Q prime. That's why it's nonlinear. So what happens essentially is that the anomalous velocities contribute to the anticyclonic advection of the trough, which reinforces the anticyclonic rotation by the shear. If you remember, as I mentioned, the anticyclonic wave breaking usually happens in the anticyclonic side of the shear. So both of these processes help this breaking occur, essentially. And this is just a schematic to maybe explain better what I mean. So we are in the anticyclonic side of the upper level jet, which means that even if you just thinking about the shear, you can see why if I would, let's say I throw a stick in here, and so it will start rotating anticyclonically, right? Because these very fast velocities will push it very strongly eastward, but these weaker velocities will keep it more or less in the same place. So you start creating a tilt, right? Which would be consistent with an anticyclonic circulation. So we have the influence of the large-scale jet, the anticyclonic shear. And then what happens is that before the breaking, we have a very strong ridge, so associated with an anticyclonic circulation. And we also find at low levels an anticyclone and a cyclone to its west. And then all the system starts rotating anticyclonically. So at upper level, we also start developing a downstream trough. And at low levels, the cyclone is now more to the north of the anticyclone, and another secondary cyclone starts appearing. And this is a secondary development due to the trough. And then this anomalous southwestward velocity that is being generated between the ridge and the trough is exactly what gives rise to this negative V prime Q prime, which is consistent with a forward shift. This is what Orlansky in that paper I mentioned in the introduction suggested. But here we suggested maybe an alternative and more mechanistic interpretation for the poleward shift. We suggested that the poleward shift is merely a result of the anticyclonic rotation of the ridge trough system, which implies a strengthening of the total zonal flow poleward of the breaking and a deceleration equatorward of it. Because if you think about how these velocities contribute to the jet when it starts rotating, so they would add to a positive velocity here and would add a negative velocity here. So eventually they strengthen the flow here and weaken it here. And this is why we see in the composites a split jet, because the jet becomes stronger here and much, much weaker here, and then stronger again here. So eventually you have this split jet structure. Okay, and then I'm not going to get into that, but we find something similar for cyclonic wave breaking events. In this case, we're in the cyclonic side of the shear, and we have a very strong cyclone at low levels and an upper level trough. And in this case, the whole system starts rotating cyclonically. And now it's the ridge that is being generated to the northeast of the trough, and also another high pressure anomaly to the northeast of the cyclone. And again, now in this case, it's a positive V prime Q prime, which from the theory should give you an equatorial jet shift. And again, here we suggest maybe a simpler way to think about it is that, again, this cyclonic rotation is basically contributing to an acceleration of the flow here, because it projects on a positive on a positive velocity here, and a deceleration here because it contributes negatively to the total flow. Okay, and this is why during cyclonic wave breaking events, indeed you find, for example, this is the composite of the jet stream, the upper level jet stream during the cyclonic wave breaking event. You can see that it moves equatorward, and it becomes more and more, it becomes weaker in sort of to the north of the breaking, and it shifts equatorward of the breaking. So it's because of this anticyclonic rotation. And then, yeah, the last thing maybe that I will show you is at some point we asked ourselves, well, maybe these composites that we're showing here, like these ones, maybe it's not fair that we were compositing around the anticyclones during anticyclonic wave breaking and around cyclones during cyclonic wave breaking events. So we thought we should probably also look at composites around cyclones during anticyclonic wave breaking events and around anticyclones during cyclonic wave breaking events. So this is what I'm showing you here. So the first line is what we got for when we looked at the composites around anticyclones during cyclonic wave breaking events. And what we found is that, so we found an anomalous anticyclonic circulation, which is consistent with the fact that we're compositing around anticyclones. Okay, so this is the circulation at the upper levels. We found an anomalous ridge, which makes sense. But surprisingly, the ridge and the anticyclone are in the cyclonic side of the shear. So usually, let me go back here. Usually, for example, here when we look at composites of anticyclones, they reside on the anticyclonic side of the shear. It's very rare to find anticyclones. It's very rare to find anticyclones forward of a jet, and this is what we find here. So what happens is that now this anticyclone is opposing what the shear is trying to do, and essentially the shear wins because eventually it's a cyclonic wave breaking event. And you can really see how it's trying to oppose it, but eventually the relative rotation between the anticyclone and the cyclone is cyclonic, so the shear wins. But this is a very anomalous life cycle of an anticyclone. that was kind of interesting. And the same thing we found for the cyclones. Here we separated into those cyclones to the northwest and the cyclones to the southeast of the wave breaking. But in both cases, essentially what we found is an anomalous or not a typical life cycle for cyclones. In this case, for example, they do reside in the right shear. These cyclones are poleward of the jet. But instead, what we usually see when we look at composites of cyclones, we see how the ridge starts wrapping around the trough, and this is the occlusion stage of the cyclone, when they become mature. In this case, instead of seeing a ridge wrapping around the trough, we start seeing an anticyclonic rotation between the cyclone and the anticyclone. And this is really not a typical time evolution of cyclones. And similarly for the cyclones to the southeast, instead of seeing, again, this ridge wrapping around the trough, we see the opposite. We see the ridge from the wrong side, from the upstream, starting to wrap anticyclonically around the trough. So again, not a typical life cycle. In both cases, it's the shear that wins. So in conclusion, when the shear and the anomaly are in the same sense, they end up with the Rossby wave breaking that we know, like an anticyclonic shear together with an anticyclone ends up with anticyclonic wave breaking, and the cyclonic shear with a cyclone ends up with a cyclonic wave breaking. But when we start mixing them, these are kind of the not very clear and not typical life cycles of cyclones and anticyclones. Right. So to summarize, first of all, I hope I convinced you that low-level cyclones and cyclones are intrinsically related to the upper-level wave-breaking events, which surprisingly wasn't investigated previously. I think it was kind of obvious because all these theories, the original theories about it, kind of use this as an assumption. But now we have all these nice tools that we can actually go and check. So I think it was nice to see that it really works. And then we also found that cyclones and anticyclones during the two types of wave breaking events have very different characteristics. So different intensities, different propagation, in general, different propagation directions and displacements. And they also reside in different parts of the storm track. And then we also found that the cyclones to the southeast, which are mostly over the Mediterranean, seem to have very distinct propagation characteristics that maybe should be investigated further because it's interesting. It's not like we expect usually from cyclones. And we also suggested alternative interpretations, more mechanistic, for the poleward and equator shifts of the jet stream associated with anticyclonic and cyclonic wave breaking events, which are usually more from theoretical arguments. And we also found these interesting anomalous life cycles for cyclones during anticyclonic wave breaking events and for anticyclones during cyclonic wave breaking events. And I'll stop here, but I'll just say maybe that the last thing so a way to move forward with this, so this is what I'm working on right now, is to try to link it with weather regimes. So weather regimes are persistent atmospheric flows, so recurrent and quasi-stationary states of the large-scale atmospheric circulation, which can persist for several weeks even. So you can find them usually either using an EOF analysis or a K-mean clustering technique. And there's a lot of literature talking about the relation between the weather regimes and the wave breaking. And what we wanted to do here is to try to investigate what is the three-way interaction between the low frequency flow, the regimes, the wave breaking events, and the low level cyclones and the anticyclones. So for example, I just looked at the tracks of cyclones and anticyclones in each one of the weather regimes. And of course, they're very different. And then we want to sort of relate it to, so it's sort of the flow regime influences the cyclone track, which influences where the breaking occurs, which then influences the jet again. So it's kind of a three-way interaction. And we want to see if we can somehow try to explain why there's maybe a positive feedback between the wave breaking, the cyclone tracks, and the weather regimes. So yeah, just a teaser. So I'll stop here and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for your talk. We're going to open it up for questions. Feel free to unmute and ask questions out loud and or put them in the chat and I'll read them out loud to the room. So yeah, we have time for multiple questions.
Hi, first, this is Dan Leathers, and I really enjoyed the talk. I'm especially anxious to see the results that you get for the last part that you mentioned with teleconnections, essentially, and how all this fits together. I think that'd be pretty cool. I just had a couple of basic questions that I wondered about. I'm sure that you know of the work by Hoskins and Crowley back in the early 80s when they, looked at just essentially the large scale circulation and what were some of the ingredients for that. And of course, they also mentioned orography and the mountain ranges. And I just wondered if that ever comes into play in the analysis that you're doing, that, you're looking at kind of over the Atlantic and you're looking over the Pacific, where we know you have a lot of things going on with the jet. But how important do you think the orography is, or do you think that doesn't really play much of a role?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm looking at the cyclone tracks, as you mentioned, over the ocean basins. Mm-hmm. But I think there is still a role for orography, because the orography gives rise to the stationary waves. Mm-hmm. And these are very much related to the large scale jet stream and the more slowly varying variations, also more related to this, maybe to these weather regimes and so on. So I think the orography, for example, oh wait, I stopped sharing, or you can still see can you still see my screen?
No, we can't.
Yeah.
Okay, I stopped sharing. Sorry. Yeah. Do I have a map of the jet? Not the whole globe, but basically, I think orography sets to some extent, a very important extent, the mean jet, mm-hmm. which then influences also the cyclone tracks, the anticyclone tracks, and where the wave breaking occurs. So for example, the jet in the Atlantic and the Pacific, they look very different. Mm-hmm. The jet in the Pacific is much more zonal, and therefore the wave breaking also looks really different. You mainly get a cyclonic wave breaking there with very little anticyclonic wave breaking, only the really downstream part. Mm-hmm. So I think the influence is through the jet. The orography mm-hmm. sets to some extent the large scale jet, which influences the cyclone tracks and the wave breaking. So it's not directly in my analysis, but it plays a role.
Yeah, but it's there, I guess, sort of sets the backdrop for the other things that take place. And then just one other question that maybe you mentioned and I didn't hear, but what is the seasonality of the wave breaking events? So I would assume that there's more wave breaking events during certain times of the year, maybe in the winter hemisphere. I don't know. I just wondered what if there was the seasonality and what that looked like.
Yeah. So it's true that the wave breaking is strongest in winter. Mm-hmm. And there is some seasonality, and there have been a few papers that looked at that. Actually, the summer wave breaking are also interesting because there's a lot of contribution from diabatic heating. So diabatic heating associated with the cyclones contributes to the development of the upper level ridge. so it really influences the wave breaking. It can create more favorable condition for anticyclonic wave breaking, for example. So some studies have looked at specifically the wave breaking during summer, which are weaker but still interesting and have slightly different dynamics involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks again for your talk.
Thank you.
Time for one or two more questions.
If there's not another one, I'll ask just one more. Again, going back to your last slide there, where you were looking at the low frequency variations and, you know, what you're hoping to look at now, and it sounds like it's still not clear kind of which comes first. Does the wave breaking really set up the low frequency? You know, I just wondered if you had any gut feeling at this point, if there's some kind of progression of events that have to take place, or if that's just not clear as yet.
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, it's the chicken and egg problem, right? It's,
Yeah.
Is it the mean or the eddies, or it's really hard to say. But I think that it makes more sense that it's first the slowly varying circulation that determines the tracks, which then determines where the wave breaking occur, which then interferes with the jet and changes it. That's my feeling, but it's hard. It's really hard to come up with a proof, or I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense too to me, but yeah, that'll be an interesting question. So I'll keep my eye open for that when that comes out. So thanks again.
Thanks.
Can I read one question in the chat if you want to answer briefly before the faculty step out? And then Melody, I'll leave your question for the student session here after this. But a question in the chat is that you said that you will discuss the relationship between the Rossby wave, weather regimes, and cyclones, but will you analyze causalities between these phenomena? For example, if weather regimes affect the Rossby wave?
Yeah, so this is kind of similar to the question that we just discussed. So yeah, causality is really hard to prove, but I think that the weather regimes essentially they influence the Rossby waves through the slowly varying changes through advection of, for example, the cyclones and the anticyclones, which then sort of determine where the wave breaking occurs, which can then influence again the slowly varying circulation or the weather regimes. So that's the best that I can say right now. This is still preliminary results. So
great, thank you so much. At this time at 3:30, I will invite the faculty to virtually step out and leave the grad students to continue the conversation on research and maybe as well as your professional career and how you've moved forward. But we do want to thank you so much, Dr. Tamarin-Brodsky, for being here, especially late at night on Friday night from calling in from Israel. So we very much appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.